So yeah, welcome everybody. So if you weren't here yesterday, what I was saying yesterday is that we're doing a whole week. I'm trying to look at death from different perspectives, dharmic perspectives, from yesterday to Friday, in preparation for the LBC's Parinirvana Day Festival on Sunday. Yeah, on Sunday, do have a look at our website and do tune in if you can. It's going to be, obviously, it's commemorating, marking, you could even say celebrating the greatest mystery in the Buddhist tradition, which is the passing away of the Buddha's body, the death of the Buddha's body, and the liberation of the enlightened mind into one can't really say. It's also a festival where we particularly remember people who have died. And so I'll maybe mention it again, but in the afternoon on Sunday, there'll be an opportunity to join in a ritual for those who have died in the last year. And if you want to send in photographs and names of people who have died in the last year, then David will put up a link at the end. Or even now if you want, to say, look, this is how to do it. Yesterday I was talking about, I was talking about bereavement, and in a way I was talking personally about the death of my father and the death of my mother. But also what I was trying to mainly talk about is how from at least from a personal perspective for me, I was trying to give an indication that those deaths left me completely convinced that death wasn't the end. And that was more what I was trying to communicate, or at least I was trying to communicate something of that. I come from a Hindu background and an Indian family, a Hindu kind of tradition, although I was never really a practicing Hindu. And in a way, this notion of rebirth is part of the Indian cultural psyche. So it's not particularly difficult for me to take that on board. But these two deaths and my subsequent encounters with my father and my mother after their death, my communication, my meetings with them, at least have convinced me that death isn't the end. But also I should say that Buddhist practice, if you meditate consistently, I think you'll start to intuit that the mind is not merely the body, that the mind is obviously intimately connected with the body and yet not completely limited to the body. So I was trying to indicate this intrinsic Buddhist kind of notion that consciousness continues after the death of the body in some form. And we can talk a little bit more, if you like, today, but maybe tomorrow, about what the Buddhist tradition says about how it continues. Not that it gives you simple answers, and actually there isn't one Buddhist tradition. There's lots of different Buddhist schools, and they say different things. But they all do agree on the notion of something continuing and then taking another life. But today I want to start with a story from the Buddha's own time, and it's a story that will be familiar to many of you. It's the story of a young woman who lived in Savatthi at the time of the Buddha. Savatthi was a town in, I think it's northeastern India. Today it's like a ruin. I've been to Savatthi, what's left of it, and it's just a ruin, but it was once a flourishing town at the time of the Buddha, and the Buddha often stayed on the outskirts of Savatthi. And many of the suttas, the early suttas, are set in Savatthi, or on the outskirts of Savatthi where the Buddha stayed. Anyway, this young woman was the wife of a wealthy man, and she had a son. She had a young child, and And she's known in the tradition as Kisagotami, Kisagotami. But in a way, being the wife of a wealthy man and having a young child would, sound like a happy enough life, but her life wasn't always like that. What had happened was she was born into a poor family, and she was not only not wealthy, she was not beautiful. And that limited her prospects of finding a match and getting married. And for an Indian woman, perhaps particularly at the time of the Buddha, that meant that her life choices were very, very limited. It's not like she could have gone and had a career or anything. There was very little life choices available to her if she couldn't find a match. And probably not unlike sort of Victorian Britain or something. A woman's choices were limited. And because she was not attractive and she came from a very poor background, I think she probably was used to just being kind of oppressed and had probably just a very low opinion of herself, and others treated her badly. But somehow she got married, and she got married into this prosperous family. But unfortunately, they treated her really badly. Her in-laws, who would have lived with her, treated her as nothing more than a slave, a cook, a cleaner, a slave. Again, unfortunately, not that unusual in India. I don't know quite what it's like today. Hopefully things have progressed, but I know that my mother, we didn't live in India actually. I was born in Africa, in East Africa, in Kenya. But, it was an Indian household. And when she got married, I think she was treated just like a servant, and not treated very well at all. She was sort of there just to cook and clean and feed everybody else. Anyway, Kisagotami's status in the family went up when she became the mother of a son, of a boy, because boys were, of course, valued more than girls, and unfortunately, that can still be the case in India, perhaps particularly in rural India, for economic reasons, as much as anything else. Horrible kind of system of inequality. But anyway, because she'd given birth to a boy who would one day be the heir and carry the family name, her status in the family had gone up until, of course, the son becomes very ill. The child becomes very ill and dies. And she's completely distraught and devastated. More than distraught and devastated, this was the only happiness that she'd had in her life, in her young life, was having a child. And losing the child, she becomes crazed. She can't function at all. She loses her sanity, at least to a degree. She's crazed, and she wanders around the town carrying the corpse of her child in her arms, refusing to believe that he's dead, and going from house to house, looking for medicine, begging for medicine, saying that he's sick, and does anybody have any medicine that could revive him? And you can imagine, from house to house, they just look at her as if she's mad, and maybe some of them are sympathetic. But of course, nobody really wants to or can really help. And then eventually, of course, she comes to a household where somebody says to her, "Look, I can't help you. I haven't got any medicine. But on the edge of the town, I've heard that the Buddha has come and is staying. And he's a very wise man. He's said to be enlightened. If anybody can help you, he'll be able to help you. Go and ask for help to the Buddha, from the Buddha." And she goes with the corpse of the child in her arms to the Buddha. And the Buddha sees that she's lost her reason, her mind. And she's, of course, she's in a terrible state by now. She's, just, you can probably imagine she's crazed, and maybe she's been tearing off her clothes and weeping uncontrollably. She begs the Buddha for medicine to cure her child. She probably is still saying that he's just ill. And the Buddha says, yes, he can cure her child. He acknowledges that her child has died, but he says, yes, I can bring him back to life. If you bring me some ingredients for some medicine, and I'll make the medicine. And she says, yes, of course, what do you need? And he says he needs some mustard seeds. And she says, of course, because, she has some mustard seeds at home. And he says, no, they need to come from another house, not from your house. And she says, okay, well, that's fine. So she knows that people in the town all have mustard seeds and she can get them. And the Buddha says, no, they must come from the house, a house where nobody has died, a house where nobody has died. So she thinks, okay, fair enough, I'll go and get some mustard seeds. And she goes from door to door asking for mustard seeds. So, somebody will open the door and she asks for some mustard seeds for her child, for medicine for her child. And you can imagine the person just says, okay, I'll go and get some mustard seeds. And then she says, no, but has anybody died in this house? And one after another, she finds that, yes, in that house, somebody's lost a father, somebody's lost a mother, somebody's lost a brother, somebody's lost a grandparent. And you must remember that in India, people lived in extended families. It wouldn't have been a nuclear family. You would have had a whole extended family of grandparents and brothers and cousins and wives and so forth living together. And household after household, they say, yes, you can have mustard seeds. And then when she asks whether somebody has died, they say, yes, I'm afraid last month we lost our grandparent, we lost our uncle, we lost a brother, a son, a mother. House after house. And one man says to her, somebody says to her, the living are few, the dead are many. The dead are many, and the living are few. And Kisako to me initially is unwilling to sort of give up. It's everything is at stake here. Her whole life is at stake, and so she goes round house after house after house, and in each household she is left with this disappointment. But gradually, the disappointment. She starts to actually notice the people. I think initially, how I imagine it is that she wouldn't have even noticed the person the other side of the door saying, yes, they'd lost their grandparent, they'd lost their uncle. Last week, so-and-so had died. Last month, so-and-so had died. She couldn't take anybody else's condition in. But as she goes round all the houses, I think she starts to notice the people. She starts to see that, yes, they too have lost loved ones, that death is a reality that comes to everybody. She starts to hear this voice saying, the dead are many, the living are few. The dead are many, the living are few. And something of the fact of death, I mean, the universal fact of death, not just the fact of her own child's death, but the fact of the human condition, the fact that we're mortal, the fact that loss is inevitable, comes somehow into her heart. That truth, which she must have known at one level, becomes more and more of a reality. It becomes a heart truth. It's that heart truth that we're trying to, as practitioners, let into our hearts if we can let this fact in, what I was saying yesterday is that if we can let in this fact of death into our hearts as a sort of as a heart truth, it's got the power, the potential to transform our lives. It's got the power to make our lives meaningful in a way that I think very few other things have. Loss does that somehow. Sometimes it's not just death, sometimes it's the ending of a relationship. Maybe it's the loss of a job. But somehow there's the powerful, potent power of being brought up against our human frailty that, if we hold it in the right context, has the power to transform our lives in a positive way. This is what happens to Kisagotami, not just because she's gone from household to household and seen for herself that she's not alone, but because also she remembers the Buddha. She remembers the Buddha. She goes back to the Buddha, and she recognizes what the Buddha had taught her. The Buddha had, in his kindness, he'd seen that he couldn't reason with her. He couldn't bring her child back to life. The Buddha's not a miracle worker or a magician. He couldn't bring her child back to life, but he couldn't reason with her. And he sent her to find the teaching, the truth of death for herself. He showed her a way to receive this heart truth. She goes back to him. What she does is she puts down the corpse of her child in the charnel ground, and she goes back to the Buddha, and she prostrates at his feet, and she says, "Lord, the work of the mustard seed has been done. Lord, the work of the mustard seed has been done." I find that very beautiful. The work of the mustard seed has been done. And she goes for refuge to the Buddha, to his Dharma, and to the Sangha. And more than that, she eventually becomes enlightened. The Buddha teaches her, and she quickly has a glimpse of enlightenment. She has a glimpse that this world of conditioned existence, of phenomena that are sense phenomena, and this world of human suffering and striving and loss and death and birth, all of that is somehow not the ultimate truth, that there's a deeper reality. She wakes up to that deeper reality. She goes for refuge to the Buddha, and she becomes one of his enlightened disciples. And part of what I think happened to Kisagotami to become enlightened so rapidly, I mean, we're not exactly given how long it took, but she did become enlightened. Part of, I think, what happened for Kisagotami is that she saw, well, two things. One is that she saw that human life was shot through with pain. And she also had a glimpse, I think, that wasn't just her life. She saw the universality of death and loss and pain. She saw that that was part of the human condition. She would have also had a sense that death wasn't the end, that we're on this round of death and rebirth and death again and striving for happiness, and then death and birth again and more striving. And of course, in that striving, it's not unmixed with joy and pleasure. At least for most of us, I hope. It's not unmixed. But nevertheless, she would have known that samsara isn't the ultimate fulfillment, that it's not ultimate liberation. And then the Buddha taught her that there was a way to complete liberation. that there's a deeper reality. And that deeper reality is in some way part of our own minds. It's not separate from us. It's part of who we really are. She would have known that. And it's that context that there's a way out, coupled with seeing samsara for what it is, that I think must have accelerated her progress to enlightenment. And of course, she had the Buddha as a teacher, the Buddha as a living presence in her life. And she transcended this world of pain, as she must have seen it. So I just want to say a couple more things, and then I want to see if we've got any questions. So yes, just to reiterate, I don't think the story of Kisagotami is a story just of a very unfortunate woman who didn't have very much and then lost what she had. From her perspective after enlightenment, in a way, she had fulfilled the most that a human being can fulfill. She was completely fulfilled, liberated, blessed. So from a certain perspective, it's not a tragedy. It's a story of somebody finding enlightenment. The other thing I want to say is that that's only really possible, not just because of her suffering, but because she had an insight into suffering. And that insight is the key to liberation. So what am I trying to say about that insight into suffering? I guess what I'm trying to say is that she saw the universality of it. She saw that all human beings have this sort of suffering. And she saw that it goes on again and again for lifetimes. That was the insight. What I think we're trying to do is also, what I'm trying to do is have that insight into the true nature of the human condition. But I don't think we have to wait until life completely breaks down in front of us. We don't have to wait until we lose a loved one, until we're bereaved, until it all falls apart. We can have an insight into dukkha, into suffering, while in a way life is fine. It's possible. You don't have to suffer in order to have an insight into suffering. Unfortunately, it seems that sometimes it's real suffering that propels us to seek for truth. That often seems the way, but it doesn't have to be the way. You can also be inspired by the Buddha, by the ideal, by the potential for liberation of consciousness, by the ideal of transcendence from all the things that bind our minds, all our the prison of self that we create for ourselves. So for Kisagotami, it ended very, very positively. For us, I suspect most of us are still on a quest, and I suspect if you're anything like me, I want to practice and deepen this insight into the nature of the human condition. And then some of the time, quite a lot of the time, I just want my life to be good and happy and get all the things I want. I've bought into the whole Apple worldview, and I now have an iMac, an iPad, and an iPhone. Not the top of the range, but somehow I've been sold that. I like them, but honestly, it hasn't made a real difference to my life. And still, I grasp after things that I know won't completely fulfill, but I want them anyway. Yeah, I want them anyway. So I'm doing this bargaining. I'm trying to have a good, comfortable, middle-class, worldly life with all the things that I want. I'm also trying to get an insight into the human condition and and tread the path to transcendence, to liberation. For Kisagotami, she managed to do that very quickly, partly maybe because her life had fallen apart completely, and she saw that the world really couldn't offer her fulfillment. She had to go for refuge to something much more liberating. Okay, so let me pause there and see if you've got any questions. I'm also aware that, like yesterday, I'm told there were loads of questions that I didn't answer. And so do feel free, if I've left something from yesterday that is burning for you, you can ask again. I can't promise that I'll get to it. Somebody did suggest that I email you individually if you've got questions. I'm afraid I just don't have time. And there were over 200 of you yesterday, and if you all asked questions every day, I would be here till next Parinirvana Day. So I'm sorry if I don't get to your questions. But let's see. David's going to read out a question. He's going to just pick a question, and then I'll do my best. Yeah.
So Carol asks, could you explain what is meant by conditioned existence?
Yeah, thank you, Caro. What I mean, is it Carol or Caro? So Carol's asking, could I explain what is meant by conditioned existence? I can give it a go. Buddhism basically says that there's this phenomenal universe with all the sense experience that we have. We have, bodies with senses, and we have an experience of the world. But what Buddhism says is that everything in this phenomenal universe, everything in our worlds, is actually just a process rather than a thing. There's nothing fixed and static there. And all those processes, they're called conditioned because they're like, they're not random. They follow patterns of natural patterns of arising. So if I consider what are the conditions that have led to us being here today, like now, Buddhism would say, well, look at those conditions. So I'm here because I came along to the Buddhist center. Well, I explained something of my story yesterday. So all those conditions brought me here. But then there's about 200 of us gathered at the moment on Zoom in our various places. Think of all the conditions that have led to each of you deciding to tune in to me talking about death on a Tuesday afternoon. Think of all the things that have led you to this point where you decided this was the best use of this hour for you. Then you have to sort of think of all the conditions that have brought this particular combination of people together. So that's 200 of us with all of our lives all come together. That's a huge set of conditions. But then each of us has got parents, and they've had parents, and you think of the conditions that have led to your birth. That's like a vast number of conditions. What Buddhism's saying is that for any phenomena to arise, it stands in relation to and in dependence upon an infinite number of conditions. Any phenomenon. From the fact that it's snowing in London, in Bethnal Green now, and it's probably snowing where some of you are. Look at all the conditions that have led to that. Any phenomenon that you can point to in this phenomenal universe is dependent on loads of other phenomena. In fact, an infinite number. We could trace each of our lives back to the Big Bang, couldn't you? And say, well, if the Big Bang hadn't happened, we wouldn't be on Zoom. Well, that's true in a certain sense. So there's no, in Buddhism, no one phenomenon stands alone and isolated. What you have is a web of connected arisings. And we are part of the web. We're part of the web. We think that we're a separate entity, but there are no separate entities. And in conditioned existence, everything is transient. There isn't anything, that's permanent, that's static, because it's all dependent on this conditioned flux, this infinite web of fluctuating conditions. And Buddhism says if you keep going backwards and backwards and saying, well, yes, but what's the first condition that led to everything? You never get to the first condition. There's never a ground that you get to. There is only conditioned existence. Apart from, the Buddha said, that consciousness, there's something about consciousness that isn't limited to conditioned existence. Not only isn't it limited to our bodies, it's not limited to conditioned existence at all. There's a part of consciousness that, in a way, isn't to do with the individual. It's not to do with me and my consciousness, or you and your consciousness, or you and your history and me and my history. It's not to do with the personality at all. It's not even to do with the individual in any conceivable way. It's like we're connected at the deepest possible level, which is beyond the distinction of me and you, between the distinction of me and world. It's not in that realm of duality. And that is enlightened consciousness. So there's something beyond conditioned existence that the Buddha's pointing to, that Buddhism is pointing to, that the Dharma is pointing to, that is beyond this realm of self and other, beyond the realm of form that is constantly in flux. It's beyond. It's said to be beyond space and time as well. It's not in time and space, and that is said to be our true potential. That's our birthright. That enlightened consciousness, which isn't in conditioned existence. That's what Kisagotami woke up to. And when she was in touch with that enlightened consciousness, again, it's not a thing. It's not a static thing. We have to call it something, but it's not a thing. Consciousness isn't a thing. She woke up to enlightenment. She was free. Then anything that happens in conditioned existence, including death, including one's own death, doesn't affect this enlightened mind. Somehow the enlightened mind isn't dependent on anything in conditioned existence. So that's what's meant. Conditioned existence is everything that we know with our ordinary senses and with our ordinary mind. And the Buddha is saying there's something beyond. There's something beyond that. And the whole of the Buddhist path is oriented to the realization of what that is. So I don't know if that helped Carol, or whether that just confused more. Maybe a bit of both. She's what?
She's thanked you.
Oh, she's thanked me. That's nice. That's great. Thank you.
I guess from that, Murchia asks, what would the process of physical death be like for an enlightened being?
So Murchia, thanks for asking that, Murchia. He's asking, what would the process of physical death be like for an enlightened being? And I'm not going to say, partly because I can't, because I don't know, but I also I want to explore that question, Murchia, on Friday. When we come to the last of these days, I want to talk more about what the parinirvana of the Buddha might have been like, or at least what the Buddha said about his own death. So hold on to that question, Murchia. Ask it again on Friday. I'll be looking out for you on Friday, so that means you better tune in. And I'll probably see you later in Mitra study this evening as well, Murchia, so you can maybe talk about it then. But yes, good question, and I'm not going to answer it just yet.
So Francesca asks, how do we integrate the lessons that death teaches us into our lives?
Yes, so Francesca's asking, how do we integrate the teachings, the lessons of that death teaches us into our lives. It's so easy to forget them, you say. And I think the forgetting is the thing, isn't it? It's so easy to forget them. It's like every so often, well, I don't know, Francesca, if you've had a brush with death, whether you've lost somebody close to you or whether you've had a brush with death yourself. But your question seems to imply that you do know that death can teach us lessons. So I think what happens for many people is that when they have an encounter with death, for a while their perspective shifts. For a while, it's a bit like what's really important in life shines out, and what's not so important falls away. Yesterday, I was reading or trying to quote from the Dharma, and I was clumsy in that quote because I couldn't remember it. So let me just find it again. And it says, well, verse 5 and 6 I'll read. Verse 5 is, not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified in this world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. And then verse 6 is, others do not realize that we are all heading for death. Those who do realize it will compose their quarrels. Others do not realize that we are all heading for death. Those who do realize it will compose their quarrels. So that's what the Dhammapada says about one of the lessons of that death can teach us. Is it's a perspective shift. It's all our priorities suddenly fall into place, and we realize what's most important. And what's most important, I think, is well, not just composing one's quarrels, but love. Learning that love, connection, friendship, that's what's going to matter, not whether I have the latest iMac on my desk. That will mean nothing on my deathbed. At least I hope it will mean nothing on my deathbed. Otherwise, all my years of practice will have been completely fruitless. What I hope will mean something is the fact that I have tried to go for refuge to the Three Jewels. I've tried to follow my teacher's guidance. I've had good friends, and I've tried to be a friend. That surely is more important. Those acts of kindness that I've received, those acts of kindness and generosity that I've tried to do myself, surely that's what will be most important. And I'm afraid that the acts of unkindness, because I can also be harsh and unkind and ungenerous, those, well, I hope they don't haunt me like they did my father. So on his deathbed, one of the things I think that we have to kind of try and do is keep this perspective of death as alive in our minds as we can. That's why we reflect on death. You know, this exercise, it's a bit of a cliched exercise, but I think I'd recommend it. It's like every so often, look at your life and ask yourself, if you were told you had a year to live, what would you do differently? What would you do in that year? I think this pandemic has really offered us, in a way, a gift of this perspective. If we can sort of rise to that perspective. I think when lockdown in this country, in the UK, when lockdown first happened almost a year ago, for a few weeks, I can remember being very much in touch with this perspective, that the world had somehow changed in a way that was completely unforeseen, was completely now unpredictable, and death was sort of everywhere, and I wasn't in control. This sense that I was in control of my life fell away completely. all my diary dates got cancelled. Subhuti said that the future had been cancelled. And for a few weeks, that wasn't just unnerving. For a few weeks, I found it at times exhilarating. And it felt like the whole world was in the same boat. And there was this sense of connection. Uh, and I remember hearing of so many acts of selflessness and generosity and kindness. Well, they're still going on, of course. But what I also have noticed, well, we've all noticed, is as the pandemic's gone on, well, quarrels have re-emerged, haven't they? And injustices have re-emerged. There's so many people in poorer countries who aren't going to get the vaccine, possibly for years. In the UK, most people, at least adults, are going to get the vaccine, probably this year. Horrible injustices have emerged, divisions have emerged. So I think as Dharma practitioners, part of the art of Dharma practice is to keep remembering, keep this perspective of death, of mortality, of the fact that we're not in control. We never are in control, that this insecurity of our existence is an ever-present reality. We live in a constructed world where we pretend that we're safe and secure, but we never really know, and we never are. And I think practice helps keep that alive. It's not the only thing to do, but I think it can help keep that alive. Meditation helps keep that alive. Study helps keep that alive. Keep reminding yourself. If you can do that way, there's a big caveat. These reflections on death need to be held in this very positive context, that death isn't the end, that there's something very, very positive that we can aspire to, and that is in our potential. That also life isn't meaningless. The acts of selflessness, of kindness, of love mean something. It's very easy to slip into a nihilistic kind of perspective of we're all going to die, life is insecure, there's nothing I can do, so I'll just take to my bed or give up in some way, and that's not what the Dharma is teaching us at all. So it's a tricky one, this reflection on death, and if you find yourself getting despondent, I'd really urge you to sort of back off the reflection and do some more metta practice. Connect again with what's connect again with love, and connect with, if you can, with gratitude and with beauty, because yes, this conditioned existence is fleeting and in flux, but that fleetingness, that flux is also connected very much with beauty. If the snowflakes that are falling now, I was bemoaning the fact earlier on that they weren't settling in Bethnal Green, the streets are just wet and a bit slushy. So I was bemoaning that fact, but nor would I want the snow to settle and last forever if they were plastic kind of eternal snowflakes. That wouldn't be beautiful at all. Transience and beauty are very, very linked. So if you find yourself getting despondent, try and connect with metta, with love, with gratitude, and with beauty. They're not, they're the other side of impermanence. Yeah. Shall we have a couple more?
So Julie asked from yesterday, you mentioned that consciousness always changes and will be different after death, which makes sense to me. But I struggle to understand how people can then communicate recognizably once they have died.
Yeah. So Julie's saying that yesterday I talked about consciousness as an ever-changing phenomenon, not as a static thing. And that stream of consciousness, somehow, something of it seems to continue after the death of the body. And Julie's saying she's struggling with, that makes sense to her, but then she's struggling with this notion that people who have died can then communicate with the living in the way that I was saying that my parents did with me, or my father did with me. And I don't really know what happens, Julie, so I don't really know what's going on. It's weird, isn't it? It's just completely weird. All that I know is that there does seem to be something going on after death. And I don't think that the personality completely disappears. Not immediately. Buddhism would say that later Buddhism talks about bardos, and I'm going to come on to that, an intermediate state between the ending of one life and the beginning of another. It also talks about different realms of existence. So this human realm isn't the only realm. Somebody might take birth in a rebirth in a human form, but they might take birth in other realms. There are non-material beings. Some beings are said to be made of light. They're called devas. They're shining ones. They're made of light. There are other realms beyond, in a way, our ken, our imagining. And, I can remember asking my preceptor, Subhuti, before I was ordained, I can remember saying to him, look, my father's been dead for at that time when I was ordained, my father had been dead for 22 years. I could still feel his presence. Not only could I feel his presence, there were psychic occurrences that he was making his presence felt in pretty indisputable ways, at least to me. Shouldn't he have been reborn by now? I mean, who was he? Was he my dad? 22 years later, was I just a closet Hindu? And had I got the Dharma wrong? And what Subhuti said is, look, he didn't know whether it was my father or not, but he said he was completely convinced that there were non-material beings and that something continued after death. And it might be my father I was in touch with. It might be somebody else. And I said, well, I think it is my dad because my mother also has these experiences and my sister does too. And some of the things he said, it just sounds like him. And shouldn't he have been reborn after 22 years? And he said, well, who knows what sort of space state he's in, what realm he's in. And also, time doesn't mean the same thing after death. Different realms have different notions of time. So I said, yeah, but in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it said that the intermediate state, the bardo, lasts for 49 days. 49 days, Subhuti, this is 22 years. And Subhuti said, yes, 49 is 7 times 7. And 7 is a magic number. And you're meant to take that symbolically. And nobody really knows what happens. And I like all of that. I like the fact that we don't really know. All I do know is that something is continuing. I don't think the personality is obliterated at death. I think that there will eventually be a rebirth. That doesn't have to be in the human realm. And between one birth and another birth, I don't know how long that might be. That might be a long, long time. It might be really quick. I hate to point to Netflix again. It seems to lower the tone so much, but Surviving Death, episode 6, is about kids with past life memories. And really worth watching that because some of the past life memories, refer back to some years before, if you see what I mean. So I don't know what they were doing in that intermediate state, but something was going on. And episode 1 is about people with near-death experiences. And that's fantastic because they have these near-death experiences, often in horrific circumstances. And they're being interviewed and they talk about how brilliant, how beautiful the death was. One man talks of being crushed under a train, nearly dying, being clinically dead, and talking about being in this world where there were beings of light healing him, and everything was radiantly beautiful. And all there was this unconditional love for him. Another woman, well, I haven't got time to go into all her stories, but incredibly positive experiences from horrific situations. And those people have come back transformed and not frightened of dying. Isn't that incredible? That the fear of death can be removed because they know that it's not the tragedy that we human beings, ordinary human beings, think. It's not that tragic. There's something else going on that is far, far more wonderful. And we need to somehow, as Dharma practitioners, be opening up to that, aligning ourselves while we're alive, not waiting for death, but while we're alive, learning to, in a way, go beyond our self-centeredness. Because I think this notion of love, of unconditional love, is of metta, as we would say, is key to the meaning of our existence. I don't know in exactly what way, but I think it must go to the very root of things. So yes, Julie, I don't really know what I'm talking about, but I love this notion that death isn't something to be frightened of. Isn't that an incredible notion? If we could really let that in, if we could really believe that, life might be very different. So let's, not wait for a near-death experience. Let's try and have an insight experience into the nature of consciousness. That will teach us, I think, something of the meaning of what's going on. But Buddhism doesn't offer you easy answers. It doesn't say, this is exactly what happens after death. It sort of, different traditions will say different things. So I don't exactly know. And Bhante Sangharakshita, he could be really provocative and mischievous. And apparently when somebody asked him, they said to him, Bhante, what happens after death? He said, you'll soon find out. You'll soon find out, which was quite a provocative, mischievous thing to say. But it's kind of true, isn't it? But in a way, for me, that's not a good enough answer. I want to keep wrestling with the question. I want to know what the purpose of life is in the face of death. I can remember when I was living in the community above what is now the larder, above the cherry orchard, I think we were having our telephone lines fitted, or I don't know, we were having Wi-Fi connected or something. Anyway, the British Telecom person had come to fit the cable or something, and I was the only one in, and I offered to make him a cup of tea, and then we got chatting, and he said, what happens afterwards then? And I said, what do you mean what happens afterwards? Well, hopefully we'll have Wi-Fi and then we can, and he said, no, afterwards. What happens afterwards? And I had to say to him, I don't know. I don't know what happens. And Buddhists assume, people assume that Buddhists will have the answers. And certainly this one, me, I don't. Yeah. So sorry to disappoint Julie, but something's going on that's much more wonderful and profound than we can perhaps imagine. Maybe we've got time for one more. No, actually, I don't think we have. It's 3 minutes to 6. So what I want to finish with is by reminding you that on Parinirvana Day at the LBC, if you're going to join in, and do join in if you can, on Parinirvana Day. If you join in at the LBC, there'll be other centre celebrations as well going on, I'm sure. But at the LBC at 2:30 on Parinirvana Day, that's Sunday, there's going to be a ritual where we remember people who have died in the last year or so. So if you have got a friend or a relative or loved one who has died in the last year, and you want them remembered in a ritual, in a meditative metaphor ritual, then David's posting a link in the chat that will explain how you can send a photograph of them to the LBC, and a little bit of text saying who they were, their name, and their relation to you. And their name will be read out in this ritual, which will begin at 2:30 in the afternoon. So do that, do that. I think it's so important to mark death and the dead for ourselves, but also for the dead, I'm really struck that in Britain, most of you are probably watching from the UK, Captain Sir Tom Moore, who was this 100-year-old man who died just a couple of weeks ago. He'd been knighted earlier last year. He'd raised millions of pounds for charity by walking 100 lengths of his garden. He'd become a national hero in this COVID pandemic. He died, unfortunately, of COVID. And the whole nation marked his death by coming out and clapping, just as they'd been applauding the NHS. We wanted to mark his death, but not just for marking it. Somehow it was a well-wishing for him. I think that's so important because, as I was saying yesterday, that reaches, I believe, it reaches the dead. So do join in the Parinirvana Day rituals, and do tune in tomorrow. I may talk more about rebirth. I may start looking at what the Tibetan Book of the Dead has to say about what happens after the body dies. That's one Buddhist tradition that has something to say about death. So yeah, I'd like to at least touch on that. So come back for more tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock, more on death. I hope to see you then, and hope you have a good evening. Thank you. And sorry not to answer all your questions, but I hope that was useful. Good.